RPGs, Episode 20, Portugal, Part 1 of 2. Welcome to The World of RPGs, a podcast in which we travel around the globe and learn about the local role-playing game scenes. I'm your host Mo Bots, and in Episode 20 we're going to Portugal. This is again a two-parter because there was just so much stuff to say. I don't even remember how we could keep it at 30 minutes for the first few episodes of this podcast. And again, I'm sorry for the delay for this one. Between family, job, and taking care of myself, February and March were just absolutely stuffed. The oldest interview in this episode is actually from November 2024. I also had a trip abroad in which I met local gamers and visited a gaming shop, but I'll do an own episode about that in the near future. In the meanwhile, this podcast has been in the gaming media with an advert in the Ludonarrative Dissidents podcast and an interview with me in Rascal News, in which I even teased this episode. So if anyone has come over from there, welcome. These regular episodes usually consist of a short introduction, I say a bit about the country, and then we have a bunch of interviews, usually starting with the actual play people from the teaser from the previous episode. I do edit the interviews a lot to cut out any and stutters and sounds, which is why producing them takes so long. In part 1, which you're listening to now, we have an overview of the local gaming scene in Portugal, and part 2 covers 2 Portuguese publishers, and all the material is actually available in English. In personal gaming news, I had that odd suit session I mentioned last time, which went great, but no further gaming sessions because things are happening in Istanbul that made many gaming clubs and conventions cancel all their events, and that's about all I can say about that. I also finished reading that German RPG Freude schöner Götterfunken, whose creators I interviewed back in episode 15, and I'm planning to run it soon. I've also finally continued working on my own game, but it's not even playtested yet, so that's all I'm going to say about it. And as I said, I had a short notice visit abroad, and it happened to be in a place we have not covered yet, and there was a very active gaming scene with which I could connect while I was there. Spoiler alert, get ready for a deep criticism of White Wolf books. On to Portugal though. After covering Spain, of course the next episode has to be Portugal because both countries are on the Iberian Peninsula. They're both part of the EU and the Eurozone and have Roman Catholicism as the majority religion. Portugal has a population of about 10 million people, and the majority language is, of course, Portuguese, a Romance language related to its neighbors Spanish and Italian, though to be honest, the pronunciation seems to be very different to how it's written, and as someone who had Latin and French at school, it often leaves me confused. I have no personal connection to Portugal and I've never been there, so there's not much to say in the introduction. We begin with 2 of the people behind the actual play recording from the teaser in the previous episode.
So, my name is Afonso Molinar. I'm a Portuguese game master, but also a playwright, a theatre director, an actor. I actually got into TTRPGs or RPGs in general because I really wanted to play them. So I just was the weird teenager that, late teenager, let's say, like getting into the 20s, just picked up a D&D book and tried to learn it. And then there was a point in which Simão was kind enough to get me into his cyberpunk game. And then that's when I actually started playing.
Okay, and that Simão is also here. So can you introduce yourself too?
Hello, my name is Simão Vaz. I am a Portuguese actor, playwright, dungeon master, general theatre person. And the reason why I got into TTRPGs was because I was working in a theatre in the UK at the time. I was living in the UK and we started off with a program to have a youth TTRPG group, which basically started off as D&D. And that made me basically have to learn how to play D&D, and that sort of like split up into learning a bunch of other systems. And yeah, like Afonso said, then I started DMing my first Cyberpunk campaign, and from then on it's sort of been history, and we've been in some way or another playing together for the better part of 7 years. Yeah, something like that.
So you both have a theater background. Maybe you can say a bit about your, you say, organization or company, I don't know.
Company, yeah.
Teatro à Espada, it's a very recent project, kind of a newborn still at this point, that was birthed, let's say, in September last year. I have a theatre company for 8 years now, and I've been playing for kind of the same amount of time. And there was just a point in which we just felt like, well, the company is called Teatro à Faca, which kind of translates into like theatre by the knife. It's kind of a Portuguese expression. It's hard to translate. But then we thought, oh, cool, we can make a neat thing here. And since Simão was joining us at the time, and we would have two dungeon masters in the company, and we were starting to rehearse and prepare a play that actually like combines a bit of the two languages of TTRPGs and theater, we just thought, why not start like a second project within the company called, instead of theater by the knife, like theater by the sword. So thus the teatro à espada and not teatro à faca. It kind of sounds better in Portuguese than what, than what I can translate. But that's how it was born. And we started with a live play and with another podcast that just where me and Simão talk about different TTRPGs. And then we have a club in Lisbon. It started out with like one weekly session in September. And now we have two campaigns and like 3 sessions each week. So it's grown hugely in the course of like 4 months. So yeah, that's been our lives for the past few months. And we are almost also getting that show on the road too. So everything is coming together.
I'd be intimidated role playing with actors, but so the show, so is it a podcast you do with role playing, or is it also like a live show that people can see?
So we have it's a bit of the weird distinctions. Essentially, we have 2 podcasts where we have the first one is an actual play of started off as D&D, and then we're now playing the system Kids on Brooms, and Afonso is the dungeon master. I am one of the players, and we have then our second podcast, which is called Dramidade, where we talk about several game systems that we have tried out either by ourselves or as part of the preparation for game club or as part of preparation for the show itself. And then we have the show, which is called High Fantasy I'm in Love, which is not an actual play show. It's not like 20-Sided Tavern or something like that. It's a theater show where the characters in the play are playing a TTRPG game, and then it's sort of like how they're using the game to deal with something that has happened in their real life. So whilst the 3 projects are sort of like aligned, they are distinct in that way. And again, Afonso is the author of the play and he's the director of the show. So he can perhaps speak a little bit more about that. But it also goes in line with the reason why we also started Teatro à Espada, which is that we've always thought, being both of us actors, and we've always thought that the languages of role playing and the languages of theatre are fairly similar. And it is interesting that you were saying that like you'd be intimidated to role play with actors, because we also try to sort of demystify that and saying that acting and role playing isn't necessarily the same thing. And we encourage people to, whilst we like when we're DMing, we're doing all the voices and we're doing all the silly things that you've perhaps seen other people do. We also are very adamant that like TTRPGs aren't necessarily like for actors exclusively. A big part of what we do in Dramidades as well is talk about how we sort of make a distinction of like, how good is this game, and also how good is this game for like specifically actors, because we do think that there are some systems in some of the games that really help the work of actors, but like they're also like for everyone. But we also talk about it from that perspective because it is our lived experience in a way.
Maybe we can pick up on that. Can you give an example for a system that would work well there?
Yes, I think so. I think one that we continuously go back to is the relationship map in Vampire the Masquerade. When we got presented with that system, which I don't believe either of us were familiar with, when we got contemplated with that, we were like, oh, this is literally just the stuff that we learn in drama school about like about like relationships between characters and who's like the dominant person, who's the submissive person of the relationship, the fact that two people see the same relationship in different ways, the whole connection that you can have and how that shifts throughout the game is the same thing that when we look at a script, we analyze, how do I feel about this character? How does that change at the beginning of the play? How does that change at the end? And so it was really interesting that that system is one that we keep talking about, because we were literally, when we were playing it, when we were creating the characters, we were like, oh, this is drama school all over again, which was great.
I would actually add on to that we keep on coming back to a few not so well known systems. Another thing that is quite particular to role playing, which is, well, basically improv. So role playing and improv are deeply connected. And although, for example, in some drama schools, that would be really, really well known all over the world, improv is a core part of their educational system, thinking Lambda, RADA, whatever, or all of the big studios all over New York and LA. In Portugal, that's not really the case for some reason. So, for some reason, in drama school, we don't really lean in too deep into improv. So, usually, obviously, it becomes quite a handicap sometimes because we are simply not able to easily get into improv. And something that we keep mentioning over and over is that somehow adding math to improv has eased us into it just by rolling dice and adding numbers. And we keep on going back to a couple of really, really fast paced systems, like Everyone is John, for example, which is like a one page TTRPG, a competitive TTRPG, so it's really fast paced. The Dungeon Master or Game Master has to keep on their toes constantly because the places can be changing all the time and the characters can be changing all the time, and who's controlling the character is constantly changing. So we keep on going back to all of those things as well. Ended up agreeing on Everyone is John as a great game for actors, even though it isn't like a phenomenal game at its core. It's just great for actors because you need to get quick and you need to get improving real fast, and that's just amazing. It's another theme, common theme.
So these games you covered were all in English, weren't they?
Yeah, there's a big thing that we also talk about, because in Portugal, the TTRPG scene isn't actually that huge. Like before recording, you mentioned a name of a person, and we were like, yeah, we know who this person is. And we've started in this for like 5 months. So like everyone sort of knows everyone. And I think one of the reasons why we've talked about this, Afonso and I as well, is that one of the reasons why we think it's a big barrier of people getting into TTRPGs is language, is the fact that there's very few works that are translated, if any. The majority of the ones that translate are translated into Brazilian Portuguese as opposed to European Portuguese. And even like big publishers like Wizards of the Coast, for example, which have the most famous game in the world, they stopped translating, I believe, by the book Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. I think that was the last book. And we're talking about 2022, if I'm not mistaken. So it's about 3 years of content from the biggest publisher in the world of TTRPGs that is not translated to Portuguese. And, they have a new edition and that hasn't been translated. So we sort of resort to having these fan-made translations, which is a big part of the systems here. Role-playing a game in Portuguese is completely different to role-playing something in English. I've done it in both languages, and going back to role playing in Portuguese was really difficult. First of all, because my whole experience up to September 2024 had been role playing in English. And, when you hear podcasts, when you watch the big streamers, when you watch programs that are all about D&D or Cyberpunk or Vampire or Honey Heist, they're all in English. The Pulp Fiction is all in English. Like when you think of fantasy, you think of Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings has very specific words associated with it that translated into Portuguese, to be honest, just sound really silly sometimes. There's a whole other layer of work that is put on to Portuguese dungeon masters, for example, that getting ready to run a game is already a big thing, is already a lot of work that needs to be done. Having to make the decision of I either go full on and use the terms in English and we just go for it, but we role play in Portuguese, or I'm going to translate everything, is already like such a big decision. And because you then have the problem that like a lot of people are good with English. A lot of people aren't as well. So there's a whole other layer of things that you have to go through and you have to think about what you're going to do. So yeah, all the games that we tried were in English. Immediately on our first conversation, we were like, this is a big problem that we have. And we actually don't know if there is any solution to it other than the game master just has to read it in English and then decide what to do with it. Yeah, it's a bit of a touchy issue, I think. It's a bit of a tricky one.
One of the things that we are trying to also do it, for example, with normal Vil, so our live play, is to just try and have kind of a balance, because we come up with these problems constantly. You can translate Fireball, for example. It's a possibility. You can translate it, but Fireball is so deeply rooted within the fantasy imagination. You can demystify it, obviously, but it's not easy. So we kind of keep a balance of bringing the language into our imagination, let's say, and try to come up with creative ways to go around it. But yeah, it's usually quite hard.
Then let's maybe go to Normalville. So I had my Brazilian friend listen to 20 minutes of it, and she told me it's just a normal day in a village thing. But apparently it's something else. So maybe you can say a bit about that.
It starts off as that, yeah.
Let me try to, as a game master, give you like a synopsis of it and try not to spoil anything for the player present. So basically, the idea for Normalville is we have three people that live in a very, very, very traditional, a very specific thing that happens in Portugal, where you have like a roadside restaurant with like two apartments on top of it where people live. And usually one of the persons is also the owner of the restaurant or something along those lines. So you have these three people that need to solve a very commonplace problem, which is a hole on the road in front of the restaurant. And they go to the mayorship and they end up falling on another hole and they end up in the world of D&D. And then they start figuring out that a lot of other things are happening. And as of the latest episodes that have been recorded, and they've fallen into a magical school of wizardry. And we keep on changing systems. So we changed to D&D. We started in D&D, but as like level 0 characters, let's say. So using the peasant stat block, everything at 10 for the scores. So no modifiers. And then they fell into the hole. They discovered a bit of what was happening. And now they are on Kids on Brooms. So we are playing Kids on Brooms, but time is still advancing in the D&D world. So yeah, I think what my imagination of the thing when I was creating it, and I kept on kind of texting my players about it, I wanted to do something very Kingdom Heartsy. So where they like had a bunch of worlds that they needed to kind of go to figure out what was going on, and they are just starting to figure out what is going on in the whole world. And yeah, I guess that's kind of it. And we have 3 players and 1 dungeon master and the lore master, because it is a lot and I wouldn't be able to keep up with it at all. So it's been really fun. And as Simon was saying, recording a TTRPG live play in Portuguese has been challenging, but the club also helped a lot because we are constantly DMing different systems in Portuguese. So it's helped a lot to demystify a lot of what was, well, to be perfectly honest, what we considered silly just because we didn't get enough of it. So I guess the mystifying part of it also comes with just it existing and just doing it and putting it out there. And if there is a Portuguese TV series, fantasy based or something along those lines coming out next year, I'm going to most likely watch it with better eyes than if I hadn't DM'd so long in Portuguese and so much for this past year.
Coming back to the stage play you're working on, the premise sounded a bit to me like the comic and role-playing game Die, as in dice or the
Yeah,
die.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that.
I remember this perfectly. I was still in the UK when Afonso said, "Oh, I've got this show and I really want you to be in it." And I was like, "Yeah, cool." And I was moving back to Portugal at the time, but I was still in the UK. I specifically remember that I was watching a live play at the time with a friend of mine who now works for Ron Rook and Deckard. And I was like, "Oh, I'm going to Portugal. I'm moving back doing this show." And he was like, "Oh, okay, well, your DM or your playwright should really read the comic book Die." And I was like, oh, interesting. And then I read it and then I sent it to Afonso. And then I think a couple of weeks later, he started reading it. And I get messages at like midnight being like, what are you doing to me? This is literally what I had in my head. So well. That's why the reaction, because when you mentioned it, we were like, and talking about systems that we keep going back to, the idea of you having a person that plays a character, which is a system in that game, is something that we've talked a lot about for the show, because there's a lot of moments where we think about, is this the person saying it? Is this the character saying it? Is it confusing? Is it good that it's confusing? And a lot of the times it is. A lot of the times Afonso wants that to be that way.
I think that Die is the best example that you could have given of what kind of happened. Yeah, the idea for the show, I've been working on my head mostly, but I've been working on this show for like the best part of 6 years at this point. I think so, 2019, yeah, should have been. This was pre-COVID. I had no idea that things like Critical Role existed. I had no idea that live plays were a thing. I just had started to read the rule book for the fifth edition, like in 2017 or 2016, maybe. And I started to read it, and I really wanted to start playing. And then I found a group to play and to DM to, and I had this idea to bring it onto the stage. And then obviously I started playing more and more and more, and all of these images and ideas came to me and kept on coming to me throughout the years. I kind of settled on an idea that I really wanted it to be confusing at a point what was in the game and what wasn't. And I really wanted for the game to mean something more than just a game. So I kept coming back to those ideas, and we kind of arrived to an idea that I focused on and that I really, really liked, that I think that was really powerful, especially it was really, really powerful, that we could have these 4 or 5 friends playing a game as a means to escape something together, as a means to kind of better their lives, to in a way. But then the game not being enough, because you actually also need to deal with real life. And sometimes you can deal with real life with the game, and that's a way of coping with a lot of things and understanding a lot of things, especially if you're not in touch with your emotions a lot. But then we needed to make it powerful enough so they couldn't escape it. So we kind of arrived on the idea of a dungeon master that had died, and one of the friends picking up on the game on the day of their funeral so they could finish the campaign and kind of close a chapter. And just because I thought it would be really, really powerful to use this means of escapism to actually not be able to escape what you're trying to face. Yeah, that's what we arrived at. That's what I arrived at as a playwright at a point. We had a bunch of residencies. We arrived at that point. It'll be kind of fun because we'll have 2 people kind of cosplaying as tieflings, but then having really, really very deep and heated argument about the idea of them having to cope with the missing friend, which they are not doing well. Spoiler alert. That's kind of the idea for it. That's what we arrived at. We had a lot of problems to solve with, like, how much do we want the audience to participate in this? Do we want to give them control of things? Do we not want to give them control of things? But then we started thinking, oh no, we are going to have venues with 500 seats. How are we going to give control to 500 people? They all going to roll a different die. What is going to happen? And we kind of let go of that. But we had a lot of these ideas, and we spoke with a lot of amazing people regarding that. That's kind of what happened and how the show came to be, and now we are almost, well, probably by the time this comes out, we'll have premiered, but we are going to premiere now on the 1st of February. So really excited for that as well.
Okay, I just realized something because in many languages there's a weird thing that game and play is the same word. So how is that in Portuguese?
Not really the same, no.
So what's the term for role-playing game in Portuguese?
That's another thing. Yeah, there isn't one.
There isn't one, technically. We've been calling them the equivalent in English would be narrative games, which we feel is pretty accurate to what they are. Because in a way, role playing doesn't have a translation for Portuguese. Again, it's another fascinating thing considering how to start introducing these games to people when even the term doesn't work. You have like tabletop games is something that exists, but that gets confusing with actual like board games, for example. That's the same term. So that's been another thing. We've sort of started calling them narrative games or jogos narrativos, as it is in Portuguese. And we've sort of seen other people saying that, but most of the time people just use TTRPG or role-playing games, but they use literally the English term. Again, when we started talking about the club and I started talking about the show, we were like, okay, how do we say what this is? So that was the thing. For example, like in English, play and play is, playing a game and going to watch a theatre play. And in other languages, I'm sure that is the same thing. But yeah, in Portuguese, there's sort of a very big distinction between those two things.
I'm out of questions. Is there anything you want to add?
I guess I would add one thing, which is the work that we've been trying to do as well. Like when the project was born, we kind of had no idea where it would end up. But even if slowly, we started feeling like there is much more of an audience for TTRPGs in Portugal than even the audience knows, than everyone knows. Of course, like Critical Role, Dimension 20 played a huge role in that. Also, TV series like Stranger Things, like Big Bang Theory, all of those obviously played a huge role in that. But even if that's the case, even if D&D is obviously, for example, our most sought after game in the club, we also have a lot of people for some other games, and we've been seeing a lot of people like come for the first time for D&D and then stick around for other games because they just love the hobby as soon as they try it out. Other people are sticking with D&D, and that's fine, and some people do, but we are seeing that there is a sort of thirst, let's call it, for not only TNTs but actual like human connection, let's say. Sitting around the table for 3 hours and telling a story together. There is an actual need for that. It's become a luxury in some way that we can spend our Sunday mornings with a bunch of people that we may or may not know already and just tell a story and have a bit of fun. So even like the broad audience doesn't realize that it's growing, and it really is growing a lot. I have no idea what the Kickstarter of it is going to be, but I do believe that there is the opportunity for a really, really big community in Portugal to start up from somewhere. I really do believe that. And also, we are talkative people by nature. And we are loud usually, and we like to get together and talk. And that's usually deeply rooted in a lot of Portuguese people. So I'm guessing that TTRPGs with all their chaos are perfect for us. We just like, as a people, kind of need to get a Kickstarter for it, I feel like.
Just add a little bit to that is the fact that we've started Teatro Espada specifically. We started it in September, and in November, we were being asked to be part of the biggest convention of role-playing games that there is in the country. So in the space of like 2 months, that happened. And I think that speaks to the thing I said earlier of like everyone knows everyone. basically, we started this because Afonso and I wanted to share our passion of these games with other people. And we knew, because, we are humans and human beings really love to tell stories to each other. We knew that that was something that was going to have an audience, because Stranger Things is a thing that exists. Baldur's Gate 3 is a thing that exists, and huge success. There are all these things now appearing based off games, specifically the TTRPG games. We knew that there were people there. One of the biggest things that people tell us when they come to the club is that, yes, this is something I've always wanted to try, never had a group for it. Or this is something I wanted to try, never had someone, willing to DM. These are common problems in the community wherever you are, which is you don't find a DM, but you have to become one yourself. That's why Afonso and I are here. Then it has all these other barriers. And then there's always that little thing of like, oh, role playing, do I have to make a voice? Do I have to do all of these things? Which is, again, global problems. But I think in Portugal, that's even more so a little bit rooted in. Again, because speaking from my experience, for example, when you go to Britain, again, that is also a problem. People are having to make voices. But also, you have like Critical Role, Dimension 20, you have all these examples. You have High Rollers, which are a UK based one. There are all these examples of how the game can be in that language. And not to mention, like, all of the media in fantasy is basically American or English. So there is a sort of like facility in that aspect, which I also find fascinating, because we are a country that is nearly 1,000 years old. We have so much history that could very easily be turned into plays or films or TTRPGs. And that would be fascinating. But there's still like that barrier, which is really strange. But more and more, we are seeing people that want to come and want to play and want to be a part of the community. And a lot of the times, honestly, it's just that they don't find it. They don't know where to start. Even today, we had someone literally in our Discord server being like, hey, I've started really recently. I started off with D&D. I really want to try other stuff. I don't know where to start because there's just so much information at this point. And yeah, so I think having those little reference points from the can and most likely will be people is great. And the more those people start appearing in the country, that jumpstart, that kickstart that Fonso was talking about is going to happen, which I think it will, and it will be fairly soon, I think. I hope as well.
Next, I talk with a game organizer from Porto.
I'm Carolina Magalhães Dias. I started playing RPGs in 2016. A little while after I finished my bachelor's degree, I was trying to find a social hobby now that college life was over, in order not to just be work, home, work, home. And I found, because of the algorithm, Facebook's algorithm worked really well. It showed me a Dungeons and Dragons event on a local game store that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But I went to the event. I only watched for the first time. I was a little bit scared, a little bit nervous. I took a friend with me, but I had a lot of fun. I got home. I researched everything that I could find about D&D. And then in the next event, I actually played, and I've been hooked ever since. I since have started playing other RPGs, not just Dungeons and Dragons, even though obviously D&D was a big part of it for a few years. But then I delved into some others, and now I think I've known a few. Not a lot, but a few.
So which other games were they?
I have played one-shots of several different RPGs because we have a few events, local and national, where people are encouraged to bring different RPGs. So I've played Mouse Reader, I've played Brindlewood Bay, I've played Monsters and Other Childish Things, I've played Avatar Legends, I've played a bunch of, actually tried out Traveler for the first time like a couple of weeks ago, which was fun. It's one of the a little older than the ones that I'm used to trying out to playing. And so I've done a few one-shots of a lot of indie RPGs. I've played a campaign for Vampire the Masquerade, but that was a few years ago. Yeah, more or less those.
So when you play Vampire the Masquerade, in which setting do you play it? In Porto or in some other place?
We did play in Porto, yes. That vampire campaign was not a long one. It was, I would say, was like 5-6 months. It was very fun. I played a small child, sort of like Claudia from Interview with the Vampire. No, it was, I really loved that character, but it was very fun. And we played in Portos. And we actually had a city map where our characters lived. And every time I go through that street where my character supposedly lived, I remember that character and I remember the campaign. So that's very, very interesting.
Maybe we'll start with a bit about the gaming scene in Portugal. So you have shops and conventions, I guess. Can you say maybe a bit about how it's organized?
In Portugal, we have local groups. We call it role-playing groups of insert town name here or city name here. So a role-playing group of Lisbon, a role-playing group of Porto, a role-playing group of Aveiro and other cities. And those local groups, they get together. Some of them do weekly gatherings, some of them do monthly gatherings, and some of them do both. So we have those, most of them find one place where they gather every week or every month. And then there's also the actual local game stores and associations that schedule some event or some one shots for people to try out. So there's a lot of different smaller hubs all over the country. I would say mostly in Lisbon, of course, but a lot of them in Porto, especially recently. When I started playing in 2016, it was mostly in local game stores and in a specific shopping mall where people would gather to play. The weekly and the monthly gatherings were in a shopping mall because it was where we were allowed to play, where the venue would allow us to just set up shop, so to speak, set up the game and play. We would often have lunch in one of the restaurants of the mall so that we would, contribute a little bit to the economy of the place who was allowing us to play there. And in the local game stores, there was weekly also Dungeons and Dragons events. Not many other RPGs were promoted in local game stores at the time, but now it's a little different. Then eventually time went on, things evolved. RPGs had a really big boom in Portugal, everywhere, obviously, since 2015, 2016. And then even after, Stranger Things came out, when the movie Honor Among Thieves came out, that was another boom. So it's been a couple of mainstream media that have been promoting D&D. And so there's been a lot of interest going up. So those local groups starting getting together and creating associations or actually conventions. There's a big convention in Lisbon happening every year. It's 2 days. It's a whole weekend with lots of game tables, with panels, with workshops, with live plays, with artist alleys, with shops selling there. So there's a big convention, and there's been smaller conventions as well in other places. Porto had one RPG convention a few years ago. We're trying to make it work again, but we're gathering the team and finding the perfect spot for it. And so there's been a lot of development, and there's been an increase in the public that's been interested, and an increase in the kinds of entities that create events and gatherings for RPGs. So before it was more informal, and now there's companies, there's associations, there's groups that get together and form really big things.
You mentioned Dungeons and Dragons. What about other games? Which other ones are popular?
Vampire has always been popular. I think Vampire and the World of Darkness, but especially Vampire the Masquerade and other editions, have had a significant fan base here in Portugal, but the numbers really do not compare. I think it's always been this problem where Dungeons and Dragons calls people, and then people, after they have tried out Dungeons and Dragons, then they get a little bit interested in, let's see what else is out there. But before, the only interest is D&D. So sometimes we do events. We actually have a partnership with Porto's Colosseum, which is a very iconic building that hosts concerts and hosts theater shows and stuff like that in Porto. And we have a partnership where we do monthly RPG meetings there in a smaller room that they have decorated to look like a medieval tavern and everything. It's very cool. And we have a few D&D tables and then a few tables with other RPGs. For example, I've taken Brindlewood Bay. Now I'm going to take Avatar Legends. There's people that have brought Call of Cthulhu and other kinds of RPGs. And there's a tendency for D&D tables to fill up very quickly compared to the other ones. But sometimes that's not the case. And I feel that what happens is that people that try D&D 1 month in one of the meetings, in one of the gatherings, then in the next month, they will try something different. So I think that's what's been happening. I don't think there's, in my experience, I would say Vampire is very popular, Pathfinder is very popular, and then most of the others, there's like very small fan bases that sometimes get together and play campaigns, for example, or one-shots mostly. I'm participating in a Tales from the Loop one-shot tomorrow morning. I'm going to try it out for the first time, but it's mostly one-shots of people trying them out. And then sometimes a group forms, they play a campaign, but I wouldn't say that there's big fan bases that compare to the big ones. Call of Cthulhu is a very popular one as well. I think Numenera also has a significance, even though it doesn't compare, I think, in my opinion.
Okay, too bad that the Tales from the Loop is tomorrow, because I would have liked to ask you, where is it set, in Porto or in Sweden? Speaking of localization, so you only mentioned games which were originally written in English. How about Portuguese games?
We don't have a very big industry of Portuguese role-playing games to be published, especially in Portuguese. There are a few, and there's been an effort by a group of people that have created something called RP Genesis, which is kind of a equivalent to NaNoWriMo, but with RPGs, and everyone has 1 week to create a 5,000 word RPG, and it's basically a NaNoWriMo, but for RPGs in a smaller scale. And quite a few have come out of that challenge over the years. There's been a few interesting ones, and some of them are actually being developed. But even the ones that have been published by Portuguese authors have mostly published it in English, which is an interesting case. Portuguese people that live in Portugal or that have grown up in Portugal usually tend to favor English as a language for RPGs. Usually. For example, the only official translation, even for Dungeons and Dragons, was only for the Red Box back in the 80s, and then nothing ever again. While, for example, I know you'll talk about this in a later episode, but for Brazil, they translate a lot of materials into Brazilian Portuguese. In Portugal's Portuguese, there's no official translation. And even the ones, for example, Demon Ninja, an RPG by a Portuguese author, which has been funded on Kickstarter very recently. And from what I know, I think everything is in English. Even the ones that are like free one-page RPGs that are published online, some of them are only published in English. Some of them are published in both Portuguese and English. There's one that I love, which is called York and the Pie. It's a very simple, very easy one-page RPG that I bring to every event of my association that will have children. Because it's so simple, it's perfect for introducing the concept of RPGs, and it's also perfect for the little ones. And it was made by 2 Portuguese game designers. So there's a few. Games Omnivorous, for example, that publishes RPGs, publishes also English games, or written in English, because I don't think the authors are actually English, but in English, in the English language. So we have a big tendency to use the English language. But a lot of Portuguese people have delved into game design, RPG design, and there's quite a few names, and it's been growing. I know that the company that supported the Kickstarter for Demon Ninja, they're going to support soon the Kickstarter for another Portuguese designed RPG game called, in Portuguese, Asilo, but it means asylum. I think that one might be published in Portuguese because the title is Asilo, but I don't know. We'll see, because it's going to be launched soon. I know the author, but I haven't asked about the language. We've had a growing population of Portuguese designers. There's a lot of them who publish on itch.io, either free or $1 PDFs and stuff like that, or pay as you want. So there's quite a few, but not like an industry with big publisher houses that are betting on RPGs. The big game brands, they don't pick up on Portuguese designed RPGs.
So, are there any other translations of English or other language books into Portuguese?
As far as I'm aware, no. Like I said, the only one that I know of that has had an official translation has been the Red Box, D&D's the Red Box. But other than that, as far as I'm aware, there's been no official translation. There might have been some fan translations, and some people do use the Brazilian Portuguese translations. So the ones from Brazil, especially people who don't speak English. But in Portugal, we don't have a big culture of dubbing stuff. We consume a lot of American media. We consume a lot of English media, and some people also consume a lot of Brazilian media. And so we are very used to reading in English, to listening in English, to understanding English, and talking even a bit. So most people are perfectly fine with getting their RPG materials in English. And the ones that aren't, they will tend to try to find the Brazilian Portuguese, even though for some people Brazilian Portuguese, because it has a little bit of a grammatical difference, there's some grammatical rules that are different enough to be a little bit jarring. So for some people, reading in Brazilian Portuguese is actually worse than reading in English. So most people tend to use the English versions. And so I think that publishers don't find the motivation to pay for translations, because if the clients are buying it in English, why have the work? Why spend that money if the public is going to buy it in English anyway? And most of the time, sometimes we even prefer it. I think there's a little culture, sometimes a culture of we prefer the original. When we're playing, we use the words in English. So if you want to do a spell or if you want to activate an ability, we use the actual original term for the ability. We don't translate it. We say, I'm going to do speak with animals. So we actually say, vou fazer speak with animals. So we actually use the English, the original names. So I think there's actually a preference for the original language if we understand it, which in English we do, but in other languages it's a little bit of a problem. The theory is that exactly because Spain dubs everything, if you go to Spain and you watch TV, if you watch the TV show How I Met Your Mother, they're going to be talking in Spanish. They are dubbed. So Spanish people have not been accustomed to English as much as Portuguese people have. When I was a kid, even cartoons were not dubbed most of the time. We watched Spanish cartoons and Brazilian Portuguese cartoons because we did not have dubbing from Portuguese actors. So only later, only when I turned I would say 10 or 12 or something, did the first cartoons with Portuguese dubbings come out. So we're very used to different languages nowadays, especially English, of course, but back then even Spanish and French. And we would watch Cartoon Network in English because there was no dubbing and there was no subtitles. So we would just watch it and absorb the language. And in Spain, they don't have that. In France, they don't have that. So it's normal that they're not as accustomed, and it's normal that they have a bigger effort of translating stuff to their language because the public is a lot more receptive to their language than to a language that they don't understand as well. In this case, in Portugal, doesn't have that. I don't know if I would call it limitation, but it's different here. The culture, in terms of dubbing and translations, it's a little different.
So if you get something from Brazil, how did they do that in the past? Would they get physical books? Is there some exchange, or does it only work now online?
There's quite a proximity between the Brazilian market and the Portuguese market in terms of the brands. For example, there's a few game brands that started in Brazil and then expanded onto Portugal. So they imported the Brazilian materials and then sold them here in Portugal. Or some people even have family in Brazil. We have a lot of Brazilian immigrants here, so some people brought those materials with them here, or when they go visit family, they go to the stores, buy out a bunch of stuff, and then distribute among their friends as gifts, so that's cool. We had some friends who did that for us as well. But in terms of selling, in terms of brands and publishing houses, I believe a few of the game brands that we have here who have a big presence on the tabletop gaming market, I think they started out in Brazil and then expanded here, and some actually were created as a joint venture as well. So there's a lot of not physical, but a conceptual proximity between the markets, I would say. So I think that back then, before the internet, that's where people would get their materials from.
Okay, maybe now it's a good time to talk about your association where you're active. Can you maybe say something about them?
Before COVID, like I said, most of the time in Porto and in other places, but in Porto, which is where I live, the RPG scene was weekly meetings in a local game shop, or two. There were two at the time, in two local game stores. Then there were weekly and monthly meetings at that shopping mall that I talked about. And then there were other kinds of meetings, but for other kinds of tabletop games. And when I went, there was no specific place where we could go to just to play, except for the game stores. And the game stores had their own events, and most of the time they were filled with, trading card games, which is what sells most of the time. So when a friend of mine, Sarah, and I, when we went to Copenhagen, we went to the Bastard Cafe, and we saw this amazing place dedicated to all kinds of games, board games and tabletop games and RPGs as well. And we were so inspired that when we came back to Porto, we were so sad that there was not a place there in Porto to just get together, pick a game out of the shelf and start playing, like a library, but for games, that we decided to do it ourselves. And we got together. We founded an association dedicated to all kinds of tabletop games. It's called Associação Quebra-Dados. Associação means association, and Quebra-Dados is kind of a play on words. It means breaking dice, but quebra-cabeças means breaking heads, which is a puzzle. So quebra-dados, breaking dice. It's a little play on words, but it basically means break all the dice. And we created the association in order to have a place and an entity that gathered all kinds of tabletop games in one place, in one group of people, in one entity. So we welcome all kinds of tabletop games. We have a physical space with 2 stories in the center of Porto. It's next to one of the big reference points, which is the roundabout of Boa Vista. And it's very close to subway stations. It's very good to get there. It's very easy. The space is open 6 days of the week. We have more than 500 board games. We have more than 50 RPG books. And they're not only D&D, I promise. We have a lot of scenery that can be used for war games. The tabletop games that we don't have as much are trading card games, but because the local stores do such a good job of promoting those kinds of games, we find that they're not as necessary. We don't have such a need for a space for them because they have a lot of different spaces where they can meet and play. And so in our space, anyone can come, anyone can play. During the times that we are open, we can accept anyone, any group to play on our space. We have a little bar where we sell some snacks and some drinks in order to find the money to pay for the rent, because rent in Porto is not cheap. And then we also do some events, specific events. And specifically for RPGs, we have one every month, a day that is dedicated only to RPGs. We have lots of different RPG sessions. And in that day, we open it up for any game master that wants to GM a session. They tell us what session they want to GM. We open it up for anyone to sign up. It's free. Anyone can come and play. And in those events, we try not to have D&D, specifically for people to get to know other games. For example, last time we had Savage Worlds, I think, and Traveler, the one that I tried out. And sometimes we have 2 sessions, sometimes we have 3, sometimes we have more, depends on the month. Like I said, it's not such a big scene. We don't have many players interested in the different RPGs, but we do also have other monthly events all over Porto, not just in our association. So we are one of the many, many places where one can play in Porto, which is amazing, because back when I started playing, there was only like 1 or 2 places, and now it's like 7 different places or 10 different places where you can go and play RPGs. And so our association not only has this venue, but also goes to festivals like pop culture conventions and other big events. And we have a few tables where we have the game available if anyone wants to play. For example, there's a big event called Iberanim, which is mostly focused on anime. It's an anime convention, but we did have a section with 4 tables where we had RPGs and people would come and play RPGs with us in an anime convention. So Porto and Portugal in general has had an increasing interest in having our association and other entities promoting RPGs in different kinds of events and conventions and places and stuff like that. So, and we are actually trying to get a project approved by the city hall and funded by the city hall with RPG clubs at schools. So trying to get gaming clubs, not just RPGs, but also RPGs, gaming clubs, which would go weekly to a school and the kids would get to play with us, either board games or RPGs. So we've been trying to have a lot of projects. We have had some projects that were funded by City Hall or by the local administrative government, of going to schools, of developing game sessions with those social neighborhoods with smaller rents for people with not as privileged social economical standing. So we call it bairros sociais. I don't know how we would say it in English.
Do you mean like social housing?
Maybe that's it. It's for families with fewer economical
Means?
means. Exactly. I was trying to find the word. I had the Portuguese word in my head. But yeah, so we did some gaming sessions in those social housing neighborhoods. We did some gaming sessions with kids that were victims of domestic violence. So we've had a few projects that have been approved and funded by the local government administrative offices. So there's been a lot of interest, and we've found some financial support to do our projects and our ideas. So I'm very glad and I'm very happy about that.
On your website, if I understand it right, there's also a project called Grow Dice. Can you maybe say something about that?
Yes, Grow Dice is more focused on board games than RPGs. It focused on getting board games to children and their families in order to promote social interactions, in order to promote social bonding. It was especially created after the pandemic, because we saw that kids were in desperate need of in-person socialization. So they really needed something to bring them out of that social isolation that they had for so long. So we created that project in order to exactly have a little bit of a standing to get funding for events at schools, events in our own venue, for different kinds of events and projects that would create some space for kids to play board games. Actually, some of the projects that I talked about a minute ago were exactly projects that were under this Grow Dice project. So Grow Dice is basically our big umbrella project for every small project or every sub-project that involves children and young people. We also have a project called Equal Dice, which is about fighting discrimination in the tabletop community. So homophobic and transphobic and gender discrimination. We have a research project going on where we have a questionnaire circulating the country for people to answer if they've been victims of discrimination in the tabletop community. So we are trying to understand if there is discrimination, and if there is, what we can do to fight it and what we can do to mitigate it and to eradicate it if we can. Especially in our association, we want to make sure we have the best practices and the best code of conduct and the best environment for people of all kinds all types, all genders, everything, to come to our association and play and feel welcome and safe in the tabletop community. And we have another project which is dedicated to teaching history with tabletop games. Now, that one is more specific to wargaming, so using war games to teach history battles and important moments in Portuguese history. And finally, we have our final project, which is about team building events for work teams or for companies. We use different kinds of tabletop games to promote team building activities. That one is the one that hasn't been focused on as much as the others. We try to focus on a few projects at a time and not spread ourselves too thin, especially because we have a lot of people in the association who love to play, but most of the people don't have that much availability, that much free time to be part of the activities and the projects of the organization part of them. So we have more than 1,000 associates of our association, but I would say the core team that makes stuff happen is more on the tens 10 people 12 people. So we make stuff happen, but it's in our free time and it's hard to do everything, but we have a lot of ideas, a lot of plans, a lot of projects.
And we hear some more about the Portuguese gaming scene from an organizer.
My name is João Mariano. I live in Almeri, a really small town next to Santarém. It's a bigger town than Almeri, but I'm originally from Setúbal. It's a city near the coast. And I started playing role-playing games in 1994 through 1995. So some years have passed since then. I started by trying to play an improvised session of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, because I went to a friend's house. He was already playing role-playing games, and he showed me the game, and he tried, oh, you should try it. Okay, let's schedule something. He said, no, right now. So he went to a game manual of one of the Dungeons & Dragons computer games on a small computer called Spectrum. He copied down the stats from one of the wizards of the Dragonlance saga, the most popular one, that I always forget his name. And he copied the stats for a wizard, and I tried play as a wizard in Ravenloft setting. Some werewolves surrounded us. I threw a fireball, did some flips, and that was it. But I became really interested in the game since then. Didn't have actually the opportunity to follow through on that experience. At a shopping mall in my hometown, I found the Portuguese edition of the Manser Red Box of D&D. It was, I think, 5 years old edition, because it was the only Portuguese role-playing product that was published in Portuguese. And so it was in 1989. So I picked up the box, only have played one session, gathered up a group of friends that didn't know what they were really getting into, and we played the dungeon on that box, and it went really poorly. Some people hated and never wanted to try role-playing games again. And I became a bit frustrated with that, but then tried to learn more about the game and started playing. And from that day till now, I'm a big affection player of role-playing games. I was a big fan of World of Darkness line of games as well. And I've been trying other kinds of games since then. So that was how I started playing role-playing games back in the day.
So what other games have you played besides D&D and World of Darkness?
I played a lot of Vampire the Masquerade and Dark Ages of Empire. I also played Shadowrun, 2nd edition. I played some mini games as well. I've tried out some Apocalypse Worlds, powered by the Engine games. I've tried some Forged by the Dark. I was also, the third game I bought and tried to master was also Call of Cthulhu 5th edition. So I've already tried a basic role-playing as well. And I'm really curious about trying new systems and trying new ways of playing role-playing games. Although with the indie scene coming to the front and the Forge influence from the United States, also tried Shadow of Yesterday. I haven't played Sorcery yet by Ron Edwards, but I tried all the games that came from the Forge. I've tried also to play some OSR games, like Into the Odd, but I didn't come back to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. I can't go back to that. I read the book and it doesn't pull me over.
Games like Call of Cthulhu and World of Darkness take place more or less in the real world. So if you play these, do they take place in Portugal or in the UK or US?
We played both ways. I know that the community here, some of them really loved the established settings by White Wolf. So they played Chicago by night, or Los Angeles by night, or New Orleans by night. But I had also the experience of trying to establish the chronicles in our own towns. But it was always seemed like a bit of a fun thing because we joked about how could such a small city or such a small country like Portugal had vampires. So I remember just trying to transport the kind of stories that they presented on the Vampire the Masquerade source books into Lisbon or into Setúbal. That's my hometown, even smaller than Lisbon. And people always seemed a bit odd. But since that time to now, I'm all into putting any kind of modern horror game into a setting I can really recognize, like Lisbon, because I've worked there and studied there. So, for example, I'm also a big fan of Cult Divinity Lost. It's a Gnostic horror game, now in this version by Helmgast. And the two short campaigns I've ran were in Lisbon, so in Portugal. I think if we have a point of reference of our common day and then you confront it with the surreal horror of games like that, I think it's more provocative and more suggestive of the kind of fiction they want to create. So I'm more into that camp.
Have you found any presentation of Portugal in game books set in the real world? And was there anything funny about it? For example, in Vampire the Masquerade?
There isn't a lot concerning modern RPGs. It's a bit of a hobby of mine. Usually when I buy a new product by White Wolf or even Cult, I usually go, let's look up what's that about Lisbon in Portugal, right? Nowadays, there doesn't seem a bit of misconceptions about Portugal. I remember there was a werewolf in the Azores Island on a World of Darkness product. He was called the Dancing Deer. That's a bit strange because there are no deers in the Azores. But usually, I think there was a mention in Boston in the New World of Darkness, a fisherman that came from the Azores that practiced weather magic. That's a bit odd as well. But besides, there's a evil old vampire beneath Lisbon nowadays in the setting. I don't remember any material that really contradicted the actual reality of Portugal. But there's a lot of material about Portugal in the Dark Ages, in the Middle Ages, in medieval times, because there's not only Dark Ages vampire, as a big section on that, and it seemed cozy enough that there's also the Spanish tabletop RPG called Aquelarre, and it's about medieval times. It has a big section in Portugal. And there's also a Spanish source book for Ars Magica. That's some material about Portugal as well. What happens usually is the names don't seem Portuguese. They seem like a mix of Spanish and some Brazilian names. So that's the main thing I noticed.
I, of course, cover Aquelarre in the Spain episode, and it's been translated into English. Are these books also translated into Portuguese, or do you have all of that in English?
We really didn't have Portuguese translation of tabletop role-playing games since that original red box by Soctip since 1989. So most people here are accustomed to use the original language of the products, mainly English, because most people here in Portugal that play role-playing games are proficient in English. And we use the English material and play it in Portuguese. So we can translate some game terms or not. And people usually play it using the original material. So because we are proficient in English, it doesn't mean that we are proficient in other languages. So if I wanted to try and play a Swedish game like Cult, I had to get the English translation. Same thing as French games and Italian games, or even Japanese games. We need the translation to play it in our groups. But there's a bit of a divide because some people nowadays from the Portuguese community would like to have those translated games because they become more accessible to new players. And there's another camp who thinks translation is like betraying the original intent of the author. So we should only play the original games as they're written. But mind the fact that most people just know English, not other languages. So we still need to play English games or English translated games.
I was also asking because in some European countries they have translations from other non-English languages. For example, French games translated into German or Spanish. Is there any exchange like that?
No, you don't have translated games. We have now original games made by Portuguese designers. Some of them are published in English through crowdfunding. One of the last ones that was published is called Demon Ninja by Disciple Studios. And it's a game about special forces in medieval Japan that fight against demons. It was a successful crowdfunding here, but it's in English. They also never published in Portuguese. There's also a recent one called Dawnfall, and it's a post-apocalyptic game. The original thing about it, besides what is shown there, is that the author used artificial intelligence to develop the game and write it, and was only published in English. We have some games that are in Portuguese, but they are digital editions, mainly distributed by itch.io. But like I said, some people even find it strange to have tabletop RPGs in Portuguese. And they find funny how we would translate some terms into Portuguese. So there's a bit of a criticism, a bit of cynicism about that translating Portuguese. It's like tabletop role-playing, but it's an American or an English hobby. We should play it as that kind of approach. It's not all people here. So I think people are a bit divided on that.
And you've also organized some local events. Can you maybe talk about that?
Oh, yeah. Back in the 2000s, playing role-playing was really insular here. So there were private groups. People didn't mix a lot. Before that, there were gaming clubs in Lisbon and in Porto, I think. And people went there to play war games, miniature games, and also tabletop games. That's how the tabletop RPG hobby started here in Portugal. People back in the 80s, 81, 82, started listening about that thing called Dungeons and Dragons tabletop and read it in French war games magazines. So some of the first people started playing here. They joined gaming clubs that played miniatures and war games, and they started playing Dungeons and Dragons and Rune Quest. But back in the 2000s, that was a bit lost, and people were really private. They only played their groups, and the internet came to be and opened the way for communication between people from different parts of the country. And the idea began to start taking shape of how can we show this game to new people besides occasionally meeting another person who is interested in role-playing games. So we start talking how can we join people, try out and play the games, and that would be the origin of new playing groups. And the idea came about of having RPG monthly meetups, free events you can just join. You usually have sessions already scheduled, and you can join for free, and usually in a one-shot format. This kind of meeting started in Porto. There was a group called the Grupo de Role Players do Porto, and they started doing their monthly meetups. And we in the south, although I live in Santarém, it's almost like 100 kilometers from Lisbon. I was interested to play in Lisbon as well. We started here in Lisbon by 2008 to do our RPG monthly meetups in a group we called Grupo de Role Players de Lisboa. And the thing is that since 2008 to now, different groups with names similar to Role Players de Lisboa and Role Players do Porto started to appear in different parts of the country. And I think that rising interest that came about Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition and the proliferation of different groups and our participation as Grupo Role Players Lisboa in a tabletop convention in Lisbon called Lisboa Con, where we had a specific area for tabletop RPGs, started to raise awareness and bring people over. And I think that culminated in the Role Lisboa. That is the biggest and right now the only tabletop RPG convention in Portugal. The last one was in past November. They started in 2018, I think. And it joined 2,000 people. It had more than 40 game sessions. It's also free to participate. They had some talks. There were games in development there. They had their playtest sessions. There were some presentations. I think the owner of Cubicle 7 gave a talk there. So we now have a tabletop convention fully dedicated to RPGs that is called Role Lisboa. Although there were also some other conventions. There was a one called InvictaCon in Porto some years back that had a section for tabletop RPGs. And there was also a Role Invicta, a kind of a spin-off from Role Lisboa in Porto as well, that was jointly organized by Carolina from Associação Quebra-Dados.
And at these conventions, what are the typical games played there? Because you personally said you are interested in a lot of indie games. So what games in general are played there?
I think that half of them would be more traditional tabletop games. Dungeons and Dragons has a big presence on events. It's the main focus to attract new people into the tabletop hobby. But there were also some indie games and some still in development games by original Portuguese authors. For example, I'm checking here the sessions that were. It's always 2 days, and it's always a weekend. So for example, there was Vazen from Free League Publishing, there was Paranoia, Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, Frontier Scum, an OCR game by Games Omnivorous, I think. There was also Warhammer 40,000, the new and latest edition. There was Quest. So it's basically a mix of different tabletop kind of games. Usually there's also a LARP, a live action role playing session, but it's not the main focus of the convention. I think here in Portugal, we were still on the verge of having our own Portuguese games. It's a small market. We have 10 million people in Portugal, but I think we are in the thousands of tabletop RPG fans, maybe 2,000 people, maybe 3,000. So it's a really small market. But I think things are slowly progressing to having our own tabletop RPG games. There are some projects in development. Some already were published. There's a game by a Portuguese author called Elder Luz. It's called Silent Lake. It's a card-based tabletop role-playing game that's kind of a mix of a Twin Peaks, because it's a small town with a lot of different mysteries, and it's a bit surreal. I know that Elder is developing. I think it'll be the next one to be published here in Portugal. Myself, I'm developing a game called Heróis Modernos or Modern Heroes, that it's a superhero comic book creating game where you play the team of creators of a superhero comic book, but you also take some dramatic decisions instead of the characters. And it's a diceless game. And there are a lot of different projects. And I think we are on the verge of that. We just have to find what is the best way to make people play our games and show them, because in the production side of it, it's still a bit tricky here in Portugal. But there is a case of success, like Games Omnivorous. It's a Portuguese publisher by André Novoa. The publisher only publishes in English. It's really focused on the niche of the market. It's the RCR-based market. And his strategy, as I know it, as I understand it, is to find the best things and publish. So here we are a bit restricted because there aren't a lot of people that won't develop their own games. And I think we're on the verge of that, of having more games by Portuguese authors. I don't think there's this particular kind of way of playing in Portugal. For example, maybe we drink a lot of espresso coffee and some cream tarts, but most of the culture of play is really similar to the American one. We make the same jokes, we know the same references, the big devising issues are the same. So here in Portugal. And we complain a lot about not having a lot of players, or Portugal is really small. So there's a bit of sadness about not having a great market and having more stores selling RPG products.
Well, thank you for listening to episode 20, part 1 of The World of RPGs. I'm uploading part 2 at the same time, so see you there.